overdrawing stonework is a common problem in drawing, particularly drawing architecture and particularly in subjects such as castle or this early church. So how do we draw stonework so that we capture the appeal of it, the texture of it, the sense of it, but we don't end up with so much ink drawing around stones that all we see is this black ink, particularly when the stones are smaller. So this is actually a really good example of trying to draw the effect of the detail that we see rather than draw all of the detail. And in this particular example that I chose, we have some stones which are larger and we have some which are quite small. Now, firstly, we need to establish the church before we can actually start to draw the stones on it. So just a few comments about this. Perspective is going to be really important in this. Not as much for the building, I mean it is, but it's a relatively simple building. But it's because all of these rows of stonework have to follow the perspective angles. So although in some ways the plain nature of this makes it look a little more straightforward perhaps to draw, because of the stonework, we're going to have to really get our perspective angles correct, which means we need to get them correct with the, if you like, more outline shapes, lines, marks of the building, so that then we can fit all of the perspective angles of the stonework into them as well. But at this point, just working on the bare bones of this. One of the important things when we draw anything at all is that the main thing remains the main thing, unless we're deliberately trying to change it in some way. And what I mean in this case is when we look at this church or this wall of a church, we certainly see all the stonework, and it's an important part of not just the characteristic of the building, but of the interest in the scene. And yet the overall outline, if you like, of the building still remains the main thing. And this is the challenge when we now go to draw this in ink, because the black ink is black, and every mark we put on the paper is black ink, which obviously contrasts greatly with the paper. And so if we end up drawing around lots and lots and lots of stones, we're going to get a lot of black very quickly. And in the end, we're probably going to see the black of the ink for the stonework more than the wall itself. The other really important issue with this, and I dare say I'll raise this again as we start to draw these stones, is scale. Now, I talk about this same principle when I talk about drawing trees. But when we have a lot of, if you like, infill detail to do, what people often think of or use the phrase texture to describe, I'm not so keen on it, because I feel like when we think texture, we end up with drawing patterns that cover a whole surface. And I don't think that's a helpful way if we're trying to capture a sense of realism. But with this infill texture, it's important that the marks we use, whatever marks they are, whether we're actually outlining shapes or doing something more gestural, more big picture, but whatever marks we use, whatever objects we're suggesting, we don't suggest individual objects, whether they're a leaf or a stone, which are too large or too small for the actual leaves and stones of this object seen at this distance under these conditions. So it's very important that when I draw these stones and or draw marks to suggest stones, that it creates the impression that the small ones are as small as they are and the large ones are as large as they are, because we fundamentally change the appearance of the building. It's the same with bricks. If we do marks to suggest brickwork, we have to make sure that the size of the bricks that we're suggesting are actually the right scale, they're in the correct proportion for the building wall that we put them in. I'm using a 0.1 uni pin, fine liner pen. I'm trying to draw this quite lightly because except for the roof line, there are no really heavy, and this gutter I'm just doing now, there really are no ponderously heavy ink lines. So I'm trying to keep it fairly light, which is going to mean I'm going to have to work hard at keeping the marks I put on the paper for the stonework light. And of course I need to have a good look at what the stonework is. So in this case we've got some larger blocks of stone that are put in on each side of the window, clearly for decorative purposes, and then much smaller rows of much smaller stones in between. So while these rows aren't as precise as cut and dressed blocks of stone, they are pretty much horizontal, which means they do become affected how we observe them by perspective angles. They're not like just a conglomerate. They're not random. There are definite rows that we see. So we need to find marks that capture that as well. I'm just now finding marks to capture the needles on this fir tree. Very, very delicate and artistic looking trees they are. We don't have many of these in Australia, just as decorative plantings, but a large specimen in one of our older parks, particularly in regional areas, is always a joy to behold. So, where do we go? So I'm going to start by drawing these larger stones in. And this is where I really need to be careful that I get the scale correct, because it would be very easy to draw them too large. And so to help me get the scale correct, I'm looking at my reference first and looking at the gap between the buttress on the left-hand side and the window, and thinking, okay, I've got to fit 2 or 3 of these blocks into this space. So I start at the top, and I'm also trying to keep my line work light. I'm not going to I don't want to do a heavy outline around them, because I want to try and make sure that they fit in with the marks. I don't want these to stand out because of a heavy outline. I want them to stand out for the same reason they stand out in my reference, and that is that they're blank and smooth compared to the surface that the smaller stones mortared together creates. And now I'm trying to get a feel for the perspective angles. You've been watching this at double speed up until what's going to happen very soon, and then we do pick up the speed a bit just to not take too long to do all the marks for the stones. But if at any point you want to see things at a slower rate, just use the settings icon that you can see on the screen there, the cog, and slow down the video to up to half speed. So you can see what I'm doing now. I'm trying to put marks that suggest rows, but I'm not trying to draw whole stones, because I simply couldn't do that at this scale with this pen. The important thing is more to have marks that can be read as forming a horizontal line in a loose, approximate way, and that I can bring right up to the border of those dress stones that are inserted in. So I'm doing a few heavier effects of the lines at the start above to help me get a sense of what is the perspective angle that I'm trying to establish. Clearly a bit all over the place here. One of the advantages of this particular building is that I could make adjustments with these angles really right up until the end, simply by making a few of the lines a bit heavier, a bit darker, to re-establish for sure where I want the main one to be. But even with me now here, it's easy to overdraw what we're looking at. And if it looks like I drew an awful lot at the start between the window and the wall, well, I did, because this was always going to be the part of the wall that had more detail drawn. Although I do go to add a bit more, I try to keep this balance the same of more detail in this closest part of the wall, and not just that it's closer, but the main focal point of our scene as well, where the eye naturally is drawn to, which is the window in the center, and then it's more likely to drift to the left simply because the left is closer and there's more detail to be seen there. So don't want to overdraw that window behind. On this part of the church to the right, I just want to create a sense of it's made of the same materials. The perspective angles are going to line up the same, but I don't want to do too much detail there because that will bring the eye away from the focal point. Just trying to work out what's happening where. I forgot to put any indications of stones inside those little squares on the buttress facing us. However, I realized that after I'd packed up and taken everything away in terms of the videoing, but I did correct it on my drawing. Well, not so much correct it as just added that detail. So if you want to have a look at the thumbnail, you'll be able to see how it looked with that. Now, you might recognize the drawing on this scrap of paper because this is one of my experimental marks exercises that I do before every drawing to just get my head around what am I trying to do, what are the angles, what effects do I think will work, are my marks creating the scale that I'm thinking they're going to create. I do that for every drawing, including this one. I played around with the angles and I played around with how I was thinking I was going to use marks to create this effect. What do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope you found this interesting. Stonework is so often overdrawn and the scale of the individual stones is wrong and it throws out the whole drawing. Learning to find the balance, and of course that is still a personal choice at times, but learning to find the balance of how much to do and how much to leave for the overall drawing we want is a really important skill to develop. So why not give it a go? Link to this reference in the description for the video. But in the end, whatever you draw, however it turns out, however you do the stones, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.